Welcome to our new series of classes on epistemology and the search for truth. Today's lesson is an intro to epistemology. How do you know what you know is true? So how do you know what the weather will be like tomorrow? How do you know how old the universe is? How do you know if a news report is correct? How do you know if you received the right diagnosis? How do you know if you are thinking rationally? These and other questions of the how do you know variety are the business of epistemology, the area of philosophy concerned with understanding the nature of knowledge and belief. Epistemology is about understanding how we come to know that something is the case, whether that be a matter of fact, such as the earth is a round type shape, or a matter of value, such as people should not just be treated as a means to a particular end. It's even about interrogating a news pundit's report to determine its credibility. Epistemology doesn't just ask questions about what we should do to find things out. Now, that's the task of all disciplines to some extent. For example, science, history, and anthropology all have their own methods for finding things out. Epistemology has the job of making those methods themselves the objects of study and inquiry. It aims to understand how methods of inquiry can be seen as rational endeavors. Epistemology, therefore, is concerned with the justification of knowledge claims. So epistemologists generally recognize at least four different sources of knowledge. There's intuitive knowledge, and that takes the form of belief, faith, intuition, and those kind of things. It's based on feelings rather than cold hard facts. Then there's authoritative knowledge. It's based on information received from people, books, a supreme being, whoever. Its strength depends on the strength of those sources. Then there's logical knowledge. It's arrived at through logical reasoning from point A, which is generally accepted, to point B, which is new knowledge. Then there's empirical knowledge. It's based on demonstrable objective facts, which are determined through observation and or experimentation. Now, later in this series, we'll talk about how facts may not always be true, but that's a whole different story. We're not going to get ahead of ourselves just yet. Now, when we research something, whether it's scientific, historical, even faith-based, we often make use of all four of these ways of knowing. When we're coming up with the initial idea for research, that's kind of the intuitive. When we're reviewing the professional literature, interviewing experts, that's the authoritative. When we're reasoning to go from kind of our findings to conclusions, that's the logical. And when we're engaging in procedures that lead to all these findings, that's the empirical. So we have these four general types of knowledge, and epistemology kind of studies these sources of knowledge, and how do we get those, interrogates them. So now we're going to talk about the need for epistemology. So let's talk about the need for epistemology. Whatever the area in which we work, some people imagine that beliefs about the world are formed mechanically from some straightforward reasoning, or that they pop into existence fully formed as the result of clear and distinct perceptions of the world. We sometimes believe there are just a set of absolute truths about the world, and it's our job to find them out, and they're there to discover if we follow the right methods of inquiry. This is the philosophy of Plato and others, but postmodernist thought questions a lot of these notions of absolute truth. Hopefully we'll talk about that more in future lessons. But truth and knowledge is not so simple or straightforward. Never has been. If the business of knowing things was so simple, we'd all agree on a bunch of things we currently disagree about, such as how to treat each other, what value to place on the environment, and the optimal role of government in society, what is moral and immoral, if there is such thing as just war or not. That we do not reach such agreement means there is something wrong with that model of belief formation. For instance, you might go outside and say you believe it is sunny because you feel warm. Someone else might go outside and say it is sunny because they see the sun. Another might say it is sunny because they saw it on their weather app. Each person has a different method of ascertaining their belief that it is sunny. Is one more reliable than the other? Could I feel warm even if it wasn't sunny? Does just seeing the sun make it sunny, or could someone argue it was actually partly cloudy? Could the person have the weather app set to the wrong city so they think it's sunny when it's actually not? These methods of inquiry are different, and methods matter. That doesn't even begin to get into what it means to be sunny. Your definition may be different than mine. Is there some absolute true definition of sunny we are all trying to get to? Or is sunny a basically agreed upon societal definitions that others, if they choose to go against the stream, could argue with? More on that later in this lesson when it comes to reasoning for the public good. It is interesting that we individually tend to think of ourselves as clear thinkers and see those who disagree with us as misguided. We imagine that the impressions we have about the world come to us unsullied and unfiltered. We think we have the capacity to see things just as they really are, and that it is others who have confused perceptions. That was basically kind of what we talked about in the sermon on Sunday. That sometimes we think others are blind, and sometimes actually we ourselves are the ones who aren't seeing things exactly right. As a result, we might think our job is simply to point out where other people have gone wrong in their thinking, rather than to engage in rational dialogue, allowing for the possibility that we might actually be wrong. But the lessons of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science teach us otherwise. The complex organic processes that fashion and guide our reasoning are not so clinically pure. Not only are we in the grip of a staggeringly complex array of cognitive biases and dispositions, but we are generally ignorant of their role in our thinking and decision-making. I did an issues class on cognitive bias 2 years ago, and the recording is still online if you're interested in learning more about heuristics and biases that actually affect our thinking and reasoning, sometimes without us realizing it. Or if you want the notes from that class, let me know and I'll email you my written notes. Now combine this ignorance with the conviction of our own epistemic superiority, our own knowledge is better than others, and you can begin to see the magnitude of the problem. Appeals to common sense to overcome the friction of alternative views just won't cut it. We just stand in disbelief and awe that we can lay out our argument with what we believe is sound reason and irrefutable facts, and have people not come around to our way of thinking. For example, Aristotle thought flies must come from meat because his observations demonstrated that where there was meat, there were flies. He was wrong, of course, but he didn't know it. He was trusting his observation and reasoning, but correlation doesn't always equal causality. He didn't have the whole picture. We often don't either. We think we have it reasoned correctly. We trust our observation and experience, but that's not always enough. We need, therefore, a systematic way of interrogating our own thinking, our models of rationality, our own sense of what makes for a good reason. It can be used as a more objective standard for assessing the merit of claims made in the public arena. This is precisely the job of epistemology. Okay, so now let's talk epistemology and critical thinking. And we're going to talk more about critical thinking in several weeks from now, too. One of the clearest ways to understand critical thinking is as applied epistemology. Issues such as the nature of logical inference, why we should accept one line of reasoning over another, and how we understand the nature of evidence and its contribution to decision-making are all decidedly epistemic concerns. The American philosopher Harvey Siegel points out that these questions and others are essential in an education towards thinking critically. He says, by what criteria do we evaluate reasons? How are those criteria themselves evaluated? What is it for a belief or action to be justified? What is the relationship between justification and truth? These epistemological considerations are fundamental to an adequate understanding of critical thinking and should be explicitly treated in basic critical thinking courses. Now, to the extent that critical thinking is about analyzing and evaluating methods of inquiry and assessing the credibility of resulting claims, it is an epistemic endeavor. Critical thinking is necessary. Now, while the study of STEM subjects is extremely important, We've lost something when we cut courses like philosophy, psychology, history, and literature, all which teach and help hone critical thinking skills. It's one thing to know how to build a bomb, it's something else entirely to know when the right time to use it is. We need to actually probably teach critical thinking and inquiry skills. More on that in several weeks. Now, engaging with deeper issues about the nature of rational persuasion can also help us to make judgments about claims even without specialist knowledge. For example, epistemology can help clarify concepts such as proof, theory, law, and hypothesis that are generally poorly understood by the general public and indeed some scientists. In this way, epistemology serves not to adjudicate on the credibility of science, but to better understand its strengths and limitations and hence make scientific knowledge more accessible. Because science doesn't have all the truth, science is constantly correcting science, and different scientists posit different opposite theories and hypotheses, so how are we to judge what is correct or what is more true when it comes to epidemiology, global warming, evolution, the nature of the universe? Even if we aren't scientists, epistemology helps us make sense of all the claims and understand the credibility of the scientist, the theory, and the process. The same goes with sources of news. Now let's talk about epistemology and the public good. One of the enduring legacies of the Enlightenment, that intellectual movement that began in Europe during the 17th century and that many say started with Descartes, who I've mentioned in previous sermons, is a commitment to public reason. This was the idea that it's not enough just to state your position, you must also provide a rational case for why others should stand with you. In other words, to produce and prosecute an argument. This commitment provides for, or at least makes possible, an objective method of assessing claims using epistemological criteria that we can all have a say in forging. That we test each other's thinking and collaboratively arrive at standards of epistemic credibility lifts the art of justification beyond the limitations of just individuals' minds and grounds it in the collective wisdom of reflective and effective communities of inquiry. The sincerity of one's belief, the volume or frequency with which it is stated, or assurances to believe me, should not rationally be persuasive by themselves. A lie told over and over again becomes easier to believe, which is the problem, which is why we need these standards of inquiry. For example, saying, well, lots of people believe doesn't make something more true or believable. The fact that a lot of people believe something or don't like something doesn't make something intrinsically true or intrinsically bad or wrong. If a particular claim does not satisfy publicly agreed epistemological criteria, then it is the essence of skepticism to suspend belief, and it is the essence of gullibility to surrender to it. Epistemology is also a defense against bad thinking. There is a way to help guard against poor reasoning, ours and theirs and others, that draws not only from the Enlightenment but also from the long history of philosophical inquiry. So the next time you hear a contentious claim from someone, consider how that claim can be supported if they or you were to present it to an impartial or disinterested person. First, identify reasons that can be given in support of the claim. Next, explain how your analysis, evaluation, and justification of the claim and of the reasoning involved are of a standard worth someone's intellectual investment. Next, write these things down as clearly and dispassionately as possible. In other words, make the commitment to public reasoning, and demand of others that they do so as well, stripped of emotive terms and biased framing. If you or they cannot provide a precise and coherent chain of reasoning, or if the reasons remain tainted with clear biases or full of logical fallacies, I'm going to do a class on those too, don't worry. Or if you give up in frustration, it's a pretty good sign that there are other factors in play than actually having a true and well-reasoned argument. Now, I can say elephants are wonderful at climbing trees, and you may question how I know that, what evidence I have. You may ask for video proof of an elephant climbing a tree or some sort of evidence. And if I just tell you they are so good and sneaky at climbing trees that no one can catch them, that isn't good reasoning, and it's something you can't really argue with because I've left reasonable epistemological inquiry behind. There's no way to argue with me at that point. This is how conspiracies work. They can't be reasoned with because those who follow the conspiracy don't operate in the same epistemological arenas or play by the same rules of knowledge and reasoning. They're writing their own rules and just using fear and bias tactics to get people to believe crazy things that you shouldn't believe. And this is why we need epistemology, especially in an era when there are so many conspiracy theories, to kind of check and say, does this make any sense or not? It is the commitment to this epistemic process rather than any specific outcome that is the valid ticket onto the rational playing field. At a time when political rhetoric is riven with irrationality, when knowledge is being seen less as a means of understanding the world and more as an encumbrance that can be pushed aside if it stands in the way of wishful thinking, and when authoritarian leaders are drawing even larger crowds around the world, epistemology really needs to matter. Now, epistemology won't give you all the answers. It's not a golden ticket to all truth, but it is a tool to help you in your search for truth, and it gives you the insight and understanding and ability to question yourself and others. Now, I know I've changed my opinion on issues so many times, and I've changed my beliefs based on new information and sources of inquiry, whether that is experience, scientific method, authoritative people, or something else. The phrase I've learned to live by is, I'm never completely right and always partially wrong. This even applies to my faith. I believe God is gracious, but I probably am nowhere close to understanding just how gracious God is, or how loving, or how powerful or just. I believe Jesus died and rose again, and I can share all kinds of theological theories on how that works. But even with them all put together, I know I don't and won't fully understand it. See, I think epistemology helps teach humility and a wide view of the world and a better way to understand the world. I think that's something the world needs a whole lot more of. The world needs to study epistemology. Thank you for joining me this week and sticking with me as we talk about epistemology. Next week, we're going to go a bit deeper and talk about epistemology and the nature of propositional knowledge. So that'll be a little bit deeper as we go further into philosophy. So I hope you will join me next week, epistemology and the nature of propositional knowledge.